Okay, wonderful. Well, welcome to another edition of our book seminar series, and this is a very special book seminar because we're welcoming our emeriti faculty who are available to join our speaker, who is an emeritus faculty member as well. So, for those of you who don't know, especially for the students, when a faculty member retires, we also give them an honorary title, usually called Professor Emeritus, which means that they're still part of our community, our family of learning, and they retain their usual email address, they retain this status, even parking status in some cases. But it's really wonderful that today, because we have a speaker who is herself an emerita faculty member, we have Professor April as well with us, April Venice, who retired 3 years ago now, yes.
Just before COVID, yeah.
Yes. And also to introduce our speaker is another distinguished emeritus faculty member, Professor Peter Rees, who served here for 50 years. Is it 55? 55 years. So we are really honored to have him come and introduce our speaker. And Professor Rees is still involved with activities at the university. He started the program in Scandinavia that UD does in Stockholm and Copenhagen, and he still is involved in reviewing applications for that. He has taught with us up till 2 years ago, and so it's really wonderful to have him come and welcome our speaker.
Thank you very much, Celine. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess I'm described as the ancient. Yeah, because I came in 1968 when there were 4 undergraduate students and no graduate program whatsoever in sight. So I've seen a lot of changes. And one of the changes that I saw was in 1982, I had the pleasure of welcoming Ida to the University of Delaware as a member of our faculty. So Ida grew up on a farm in northern part of the Netherlands. She went to the University of Groningen, which is one of the major universities in the Netherlands, as an undergraduate. And then in 1973, she came to the University of Michigan to study anthropology. She got a master's in anthropology. And then after that, she bummed around a little, doing archaeological work in Mexico and Iran, and also in Indonesia, I think, didn't you?
No, in Indonesia.
But anyway, it was quite worldwide. But she finally gravitated back and discovered that really she should be in geography. And so she came to the University of Wisconsin in 1976. And she studied under the very well-known, at least to us, historical geographer David Ward. David Ward actually became a very successful geographer and became the chancellor, what they call the chancellor, but it's actually really the president of the University of Wisconsin. So he's been a very influential individual over the course of time. So Ida studied with him for her PhD, and she came to Delaware. And she's had a varied academic career. Her work has spanned a lot of different areas. She started off writing articles about the historical, geographical aspects of the pharmaceutical industry in this region. She subsequently got a joint appointment with what was then called the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy, which is now being incorporated into public policy, I believe. And she got quite involved in environmental matters and finished up writing a book called the Corporate Greenhouse, thank you, which emphasized the role of global companies in carbon trading. And it was quite a well-received book at the time, and it advanced her career significantly. And her present interest really stems from an association that both of us were involved in called the Eastern Historical Geographical Association, or the EHGA. And the EHGA was primarily a group of historians and historical geographers who met annually with a very broad geographical definition of Eastern. So our meetings extended as far west as Colorado and as far east as Barbados. And it was at the Barbados meeting that Ida and I both attended, and she uncovered or discovered the existence of the colonial archives in Barbados, which focused particularly strongly on the role of Barbados in the early Atlantic trade in the 17th century. At that time, in the 17th century, Barbados and Boston together were the most important ports in the New World regarding this 17th century trade. And Ida recognized that she had a unique ability to be able not only to read the documents in English, of course, but also the fact that the other end of the trade was particularly focused on Amsterdam. And of course, she could read Dutch. So she had the ability to see both ends of this trading relationship. And so she focused her attention on the way in which that trade was organized, who organized it, what impact did the organization have on the application of the trade to shaping basically the social, cultural, and economic features of both the old and the new world. So a very important component of understanding that particular aspect of the way in which our world has developed. Naturally enough, her first subject was to look at the staple of sugar, because sugar probably was the most dominant of the influences of that trade. But subsequently, after she published a book on that in 2019, continued to be retired, but continued to work, and found that tobacco was an earlier but equally significant staple in terms of the way the trade of tobacco worked out, not so much in Barbados this time, but more in the area, the northern edge of South America. And so her current book, which she promises to be her last book, but we never can be sure, is focused on that particular trade, and that's what she's here to discuss today. So Ida, welcome to discuss the Portuguese Sephardic trade in
Peter,
Very
I
well.
could never have summarized my whole. How many volumes in academia? I was more I couldn't say. That is great.
Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. Wonderful to hear one of your colleagues who, and we have known each other for 40 years. So that is a lot that has passed in 40 years. And Peter has been all throughout these comings and goings, also been he has been my mentor in many ways, if you didn't already sort of put that. And he's edited extensively. He's seen all my book manuscripts as they came out, have done. And Peter must have devoted.
Sure, I know a lot more
Oh.
than I ever wanted to.
Anyway, you got the picture. So we've worked a great deal together. And I'm being hosted by Peter, which I much appreciate. So, could say a whole lot more. But I'll start on my paper. And I will try to stick to the draft. And if I don't, forgive me, because I often cannot read all the time. And if I deviate too much, and I don't have PowerPoint to back me up, and no maps that I can flash back and forth with, I'm going to assume that you've read this short synopsis and that you know a little bit of geography of the Caribbean and that you know where Amsterdam is.
And we have a map there.
There we go. Anyway, just point to that. I will try to stay to the draft, but I may not. But to start with, in the early 17th century, as you well know, and as Peter pointed out, Amsterdam became the world's main colonial staple market. Merchants had transferred their business by then from Antwerp, which was a bit further south in the Spanish Habsburg realm, the main port, but the Dutch stood up and said, we don't like the Spanish so much anymore, and we're gonna do it on our own. And much of the business transferred from Antwerp at a time when war emerged, but transferred to Amsterdam. So my book is about, in that sense, Amsterdam and the tobacco trade. Now, Sephardic Jews were resident in Amsterdam, had moved along with the trade that occurred in the Habsburg realm, the Spanish European realm, and they had established themselves as merchants, if not openly professing Judaism, but then at least inclined to build a community around these principles of Judaism. And they were known as Sephardic Jews, having originated, I'm already off script, incidentally, having come from the Spanish Portuguese territories, had been expelled from Spain in 1492, thereabouts, and then moved to Portugal, and there tried to reestablish their business, and were expelled 5 years later and moved on, essentially. Dispersed throughout the Mediterranean, Morocco, the Levant, Eastern Mediterranean areas, and to cities along the Atlantic coast. Amsterdam, Amsterdam primarily. I guess I could definitely say that. Now,
Peter, maybe you might mention why in 1492 they were expelled.
Well,
Because
yeah.
a lot of these
This was Isabel
yeah.
and
Ferdinand.
thank you, didn't come right up. But they were at that time, they had incidentally already converted, many Jews converted to Christianity as they had been persecuted in Spain. But in 1492, which happens to be, of course, the Columbus discovery. So not to go into all the details, but this had already, the expulsion had occurred on time earlier since the 12th century, essentially. So it was a discarded group, and many ended up in Portugal, and then subsequently the same fate happened there. Now, I take a historical geographic perspective, as Peter tried to also emphasize here. And that means I consider the market an important and central factor in my story. That is, merchants from port cities on the west coast of Europe at the time were not only taking supplies, but also processing, and that was, in various forms, sugar refining or tobacco spinning and mixing, and then distributing the product, well, throughout as far as they could reach. And that in the case of early 17th century Amsterdam, in part with the assistance of the network of contacts that existed, primarily through these expelled communities that conducted the trade to the Mediterranean, and in fact all the way into the Middle East, the Levant, then known as. So that's the sort of supply and distribution I consider important factors to explain a successful trading network. Now, the Sephardic Jews were considered those who had migrated and established communities in Amsterdam primarily, but later in Hamburg and in other Bayonne, France, in other parts in Europe. They were considered at the time from the Spanish perspective, they were interlopers. They were not. Now I have to give you another bit of the puzzle here. The Dutch Republic, Netherlands known at that time as the Dutch Republic in the 17th century, was a country at war to establish Protestantism in opposition to Catholic Habsburg rule that had been established through many parts of Europe under Spanish rule. The Netherlands, the Low Countries, were part of the Habsburg Empire, and they, in opposition, fought against that imposition of Catholic rule and established essentially a Protestant nation. So the historical context is important because at the time, in the 80 Years' War, as it is known in Dutch history, from 1568 to 1648, 80 years, the Dutch Republic was at war. And that meant embargoes at sea, blockades of ports and harbors, raiding each other out at sea. If you hadn't seen some of the Dutch landscapes, paintings clearly demonstrate there were often sea battles, and yeah, that's a pretty down. That was the early onset of it. That was the golden age in Dutch history. And it's quite a remarkable history in the sense that in the golden age, while at war, for that good part of the 17th century, they also established all these trade relationships. So it was in order to supply salt that was usually found or gotten in Portugal, when Portugal and Spain at the time of the Habsburgs were at war with the Dutch merchants who needed salt for the herring fisheries couldn't supply this important resource, salt. And they ventured out to find it somewhere else. And that somewhere else happened to be the north coast of South America, where they established major salt mining or salt gathering as supplies. And as part thereof, they came in contact with indigenous populations that conducted an exchange trade among each other or with anyone who would care to come ashore. And well, that's how much of the original trade originated. That's how much of that first started. And so these important early contacts that came about along with being at war, with the dominant force, in this case Spain and Portugal, also meant that people who wanted or were traditionally involved in this trade with, say, Portugal, also moved along with this effort to obtain salt, as important as it was, or pearls as they were found nearby on La Margarita Island, somewhere along the shore there or something. This started the whole trade, and that included, well, in this case, tobacco. Tobacco was prevalent and found all along the shoreline. It wasn't something that was uniquely or specific to these contact points where the Dutch traded. It was found in many other places where indigenous exchange took place. But the Dutch had reason, or any other group involved, the English were involved in this as well, and I shall add that. And the French later on, specifically on Hispaniola, I've also studied that case. There the French were engaged in similar kind of exchange activities, but much of it started that way. Now, I like to point out that as these contacts came about and as early trade directed for distribution through Europe, Northern Europe first, but then Mediterranean and Eastern Europe as well. But as these networks of contacts emerged, this engaged groups that were kind of prepared to take part, outcasts or interlopers to begin with, ready to adjust to opportunities like trading with the Dutch and the English in the Caribbean, became opportunity for many of these disguised or expelled groups. That's essentially, in a broad sense, the background to these matters. I started with this research while I was still involved in the sugar trade research. I don't have a copy of, I have a copy of it in my bag, but you see, there's a display of my book, as I discovered this morning, that is on the sugar trade. And the research I did, as Peter pointed out, in the archives in the Netherlands from time to time, and they had the opportunity. And then when I traveled to Barbados to delve into the archives in Barbados, and as this, I knew that along sugar, tobacco also was traded. But I didn't know, and I couldn't say with certainty, that places where sugar was important, like in Brazil, also were the starting tobacco exchange trade points. That I couldn't say for sure, although I knew that in the case of Brazil, sugar and tobacco were traded side by side, which suggested initially to me that it were the same merchants groups that participated, the Dutch with their interlopers, the Sephardic Jewish merchants. I suspected there was a relationship between the two. But I also knew that in the case of Barbados, tobacco preceded sugar. Yeah. Sugar is what Barbados became known for. Sugar is what I had studied in the archives in Barbados. But I knew, and the historical literature also pointed that in that direction, that tobacco had preceded sugar, which could still suggest that there was a relationship between merchants that had traded the tobacco and then became engaged with sugar. But the relationship was not clear. And I figured likely that wasn't even the case. I'm just sketching here a little bit how the research in the tobacco started as a follow-up on questions I was left with after I finished my research on the sugar trade. Sugar started in Egypt, in the Orient, actually in India, to be more precise, at small scale, and transferred gradually through the Middle East, the Mediterranean, to the islands of the west coast of Africa, Sao Tome, Madeira, and then to Brazil, and then to Barbados and Jamaica, and it seemed like to follow, an expansion from east to west, obviously. And tobacco was the opposite. There was no tobacco known in 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 16th centuries. But tobacco was indigenous to the Americas. And it was a crop used in ritual performances and for pleasure, no doubt. And it was traded in various places, exchanged between groups, which included indigenous population, but over time also other groups. And in fact, in many parts of South America, it engaged runaway slaves, Maroons, and Yeah, and then gradually through the expansion of trade, European context, it was consumed in Europe at large scale, and gradually all over the Orient, Persia, or Iran today, and India, everywhere. But it was just the opposite. So I was left with that question, but that needs further explanation. It are likely not the exact same merchants who traded in sugar and tobacco, and then that it was a different sequence. And that proved to be the case. If any place, it is along the area around Trinidad. Now, where is Mary? There's Mary. You know probably better than I do, but Trinidad and then the coast further to the west, or a little more broadly speaking, Tierra Firme is the area I focused on, and tobacco became an important trade. It was between the Orinoco and the Amazon Delta area. Yeah. And that was not Brazil, and that was not Barbados. And in the Caribbean, on the Caribbean islands, it was what is today Haiti and the Dominican Republic, known still Espanol, still used as a general island description. It wasn't Barbados. In fact, sugar preceded tobacco in the case of Hispaniola. Yeah, sugar was introduced by the Spanish. It fell to poor times when Portuguese Brazil became the major export colony for sugar. Sugar export from Hispaniola under Spanish rule essentially ceased to exist. Spanish settlers moved to Peru, Mexico, where there was silver to be gotten and could get rich. And there was a hole left. And it was at that time that other European merchants came to raid, including the French, who later established rule in Hispaniola, but also the Dutch, who gladly picked up the pieces, and with them, Portuguese merchants. Yeah? And most of the coast in the mid-17th century, Hispaniola was described as an island not consisting of Spanish settlers, as you would suspect, as a Spanish colony, but most all the population lived on the coast, and they were Portuguese of converso, in other words, converted Jews to Catholicism, converso merchants that had settled along the shores of Hispaniola, engaging in the tobacco trade in various islands and various parts of the Caribbean area. So that's the sort of context in which the Dutch subsequently, and with them on board, Portuguese pilots or Sephardic merchants from Amsterdam, having established contacts, trade relationships with each other and with coastal populations in South America, on the islands. That's how the context in which this tobacco trade developed. Now, to go back to Amsterdam just for a moment, whereas I was aware about how many sugar refineries there were in the mid-17th century in Amsterdam, these were larger establishments. They were capital intensive, they required a good number of workers, and it was major employment in Amsterdam in the mid-17th century. And tobacco was not known for that. Tobacco production and refining or mixing and spinning and mixing, as it was known, was a family enterprise. There were studies done that suggested, but we don't know, still don't know how many small merchant families, but presumably merchant families who had in the attic or in the basement, a tobacco processing operation. But we do know that from Amsterdam, tobacco was shipped all over Northwestern Europe. So it must have been, in terms of total volume, substantial. There are sort of estimates made, but they say tobacco processing employed a great many more people in Amsterdam in the mid-17th century than sugar. In terms of total, what we suspect based on distribution of tobacco from Amsterdam, of which we know a little bit more. Through the what we today would call the stock exchange, the markets developed on a regular basis to trade commodities. Tobacco was one of these commodities that was traded on the stock exchange bank in Dutch terms. And that total volume must have been a lot more than sugar. And it was traded, we do know, by Jewish merchants. I came across one study that suggested that there were, now I'll try to remember now, recall on the top of my head, as I've lost the page. 365 stockbrokers registered with the stock exchange, and of which there were suspected, that is based on their names, 86 Jewish merchants. Now, is that a lot? Is that there were Huguenots, there were many other groups trading in Amsterdam, but it seems to be a substantial share. Were they residents in Amsterdam? Likely, but they may also have been factors or people who, traded in behalf of merchants from somewhere else. We don't really know, but it sounds like a substantial percentage from total number of people who traded on the stock exchange in Amsterdam. So these are the sorts of leads you have. These are the sorts of information you can gather, because the official records, that is the notary public records, which would, make contracts between merchants when they trade goods, contractual arrangements, that doesn't reveal much about tobacco trade, as it turns out, as it was in the countries who were then beginning to consume, and in the 1620s, we know most countries began to regulate tobacco trade. What did that mean? Well, the devil's weed, as it was known, not too kosher, so to say, was not a legitimate trade good. It was a illegitimate, hey, call it hashish, as we marijuana, right? So all of this is captured in a sort of a cloud of mystery, yet you begin to understand as you see some of these incidental pieces of evidence that it was a substantial trade, but it's not in the public records. It's not the notary records. You don't find it there. There I found most of the evidence, as you perhaps read from this synopsis, most of the evidence comes from reports that Spanish officials sent about their territories, the governors, in other words, the audiencias, the reporting agencies in the Spanish realm that reported on business affairs in their territories. It wasn't like, oh, we just shipped 100 tons of tobacco from Trinidad. It wasn't like that, but it was these records almost always refer to illegal trade. Now, it was, since this was not supposed to happen, this didn't render any profit to the Spanish. This did not render any tax revenue. All this trading going on among these coastal populations and the sailing merchants from Europe, that was illegal trade. That wasn't supposed to happen. And so they tried to limit that through imposing embargoes, to the point that is embargoes, blockades, stop this business, attack them at sea, yeah, to the point that Spanish officials began to officially recommend that areas where, say, for instance, the salt pans were in Araya, yeah, off the coast of South America, that these places should be inundated. They should just simply wipe it off the map so that there would be no enticement for merchants to come ashore and trade with the indigenous population. Serious plans to inundate coastal areas so that illegal trading would stop. Yeah, and or depopulate areas. Hispaniola, the northwest coast of Hispaniola, it's now Haiti, yeah, was one of these places where there was such an open, blatant, illegal trade going on that the Spanish officials said, well, we got to take these people, these coastal folks away from the enticement or the temptation to trade with the Dutch and the English and the French. We'll take them. They will have to move with their cattle, which they were herding in that part of Hispaniola, and take them closer to Santo Domingo, where we can at least oversee this and control their comings and goings. Well, these are nice suggestions, but of course the local people were often not in favor of this. And as it turned out, the Spanish overseers, the officials in these areas where smuggling occurred, were also not in favor of removal, because as often the references were made, well, we benefit from this. Are we surprised? We don't want to see this stop, and we do not want to see but the bribery, fraud that occurs go on there. We are friends with the coastal folks, and we like to see this continue. And then reports came from both Cumana, on the north coast of South America, and Hispaniola, that, well, what if we could arrange this through some contractual arrangement? We will send the Spanish fleet out to the island to deliver more, well, woolens and silk and arms and implements and everything they want, and then buy up the tobacco by contract for a set price. Hey, that sounds sort of familiar, doesn't it? Yes, that's how you try to regulate trade. And that way we can at least oversee it and get some tax revenue from it. And we could do that with any merchant who wants to supply, say, silk, woolens, implements, tools. And who were that? Well, they happen to be not the Spanish, but they happen to be the Dutch and people in the, well, emerging England, places where silks and woolens were woven and where ironworks and implements were made. So in a sort of back way, it came back to the Dutch. And by the 1620s and 30s, that's how that trade occurred. And the Dutch were after all, though it were originally subjects which the Spanish like to submit again to their rule, they were, after all, still official subjects of the Habsburg Empire. So it gave very twisted relationships. But despite all the efforts to regulate, which I've now begun to learn a little bit more about, none of these efforts really worked because the networks had already been established in the early 17th century. By 1630, 40, when they began to promote regulation of trade of some sort, there was a whole network, a whole trade network via the Canary Islands, the Azores, and various places in the Caribbean. Networks that existed, where contacts occurred all the time between Portuguese converso or Portuguese coastal populations and Dutch and Sephardic merchants from Amsterdam. These networks were built in, so to say. So the illegal trade continues. When you read the literature on piracy in the Caribbean, illegal trade, mostly from the late 7th and 18th century, even later still, there's a lot written about that. And by the English, by the French, by the Dutch. We know a great deal about how it turned out to operate in the 18th century. Yeah. But we knew till recently, and I like to think that my book sort of has been the start of that. We didn't really know till, well, you delve into these earlier original phases of development. We didn't really know how it started. And that's what I had hoped to reveal with the study I conducted. And now I'm completely off script. So I'm going to just leave it to you to ask me some questions. And maybe that's the best way to continue. And I'll be happy to elaborate more.
Yes, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I was going to just put up some interesting points which came to me for the benefit of the students, especially who are coming from lots of different parts of the geographic disciplinary area. So I mean, clearly, one of the areas I should mention that you brought up front is the illicit trade aspect. And currently, we actually have a large National Science Foundation grant, which is led by Professor Julie Klinger on illicit trade of minerals currently, and looking at trade flows with multiple methods. So there's one connection there, historically, how it happened compared to now. There's another connection, which is around migration itself and what happened in terms of there was forced displacement, clearly, of the Sephardic Jews, and they brought with them a certain skill set which allowed them to capitalize on this particular area, right? And so the migration and the diaspora, and there's this term that's used, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this term is used by Amy Chua, who's a professor at Yale Law School, of market dominant minorities. She wrote this book called World on Fire. And I'm wondering how you would consider this aspect of the market dominant minorities in the case of the Sephardic population, and what was it that allowed them to build that critical mass around the tobacco trade, particularly, like working in the families and the basements? There was something about the trust needed for
that I would certainly say. These are smaller and minority communities. Yes. And I didn't mean to say this was the only merchant trading group in Amsterdam. There were Armenians, there were Huguenots, if I may just mention a few other groups that, not so much in the tobacco, but in other areas, were trading. And from my perspective, though, the community elements, they knew each other. Yeah, there were family groups that had followed each other in migration and subsequently in trade. I think that's an important part of the story. And with that is a trust, and you don't go to the notary public to write down that you traded with so and so to, make a contract. These are family groups that trust each other in trade and know that if they don't live up to their agreements, well, they won't be in the network anymore. And I think that is one very important part of what you could call trust that is at work here.
Couldn't you also argue, in addition to that, that Sephardic Jews were already in a minority and were barely tolerated by the communities they lived within, and that further reinforced the sort of connections within families of this issue of trust? Because I think the issue of trust goes right to the present day. I mean, global corporations interacting across the world, trust is a key as to whether we can trust the person we're dealing with to do our business in another part of the world. So it's the same situation that we have today. And maybe the focus of the Sephardic Jews was partly because they were such a minority and barely tolerated. I mean, I know in Barbados that's the case, right?
Yeah. No, that is very.
And it's interesting with minerals also. We see in India with the Jain community, they have a dominance in the diamond cutting sector, which I've done some work on. And it's also a minority community, and they have 70% of the diamond cutting industry in India is dominated by them.
Yeah.
And so you see this time and again this phenomenon, which is really fascinating in this regard.
Yeah. And they moved. That is, when whoever would tolerate that presence or saw opportunities, the tolerance, the upper side of that is maybe to say we see opportunity.
Yeah, because
the Dutch no doubt found opportunities in establishing their dominance in Atlantic trade in some areas. If they had these very rich is perhaps not the term to use here, but the Jewish population in the 17th century were considered self-banking. They had finances from trade. So that always helped if you were Dutch and you tried to do some business. Well, say these things, opportunities and tolerance are not far apart in that sense. Is that right, Peter? Or did I answer?
Julie Klinger, thanks so much for sharing your work with us. I was really captivated and perhaps horrified by a mention that you made in terms of a sort of prevention measure to stop the illegal trade, which was simply, I think you said, to inundate these coastal areas and depopulate. That sounds to me like scorched earth type. Could you provide a little bit more?
Yeah, this happened. This became a big issue, and both from Hispaniola and from Tierra Firma, where I had studied, in 1604, 1605, these proposals, or first the crown would say, well, we need to investigate this. Well, any kind of instruction takes a while to get from Spain to Hispaniola. But so in 2005, 1605, 1607, these things began to kind of gel. Yeah. Then the order came from the crown. Well, the order by Cedula that, and there is a whole expose of that. This was 1607 or thereabouts, the order was made. And very quickly, when these so-called orders were made, there came opposition from local officials. Yeah, how are we gonna do that? What are we gonna do with all these people who now live around Santo Domingo and come with all their cattle? Yeah, so it was very often followed, and that was the case by 1609, that they reversed the orders and that they tried to engage in, so that happened in both places. And I'm sure if I had studied Cuba at the time, it would have been the same story, because we know similar developments there. That seemed to be the, yeah.
This reminds me of the ways the Spanish colonial local administrators tended to operate when they got instructions from the crown. Obedezco, pero no cumplo.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I obey, but I don't choose to comply.
Yeah. And they were too far away, and they were in peripheral areas. These were not Mexico or Peru, where gold and silver was at stake. This was the devil's weed, after all, right? Who cares? Yeah, so it was, well, it was just not carried out. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question actually to that? So was there anything in the archive about the methods of inundation? Like I'm thinking about
Well,
constructing or earthworks.
Yeah, no, this was Punta de Araya, which is where the salt pans. Because they believed that if you get the Dutch away from the salt pans, there won't be Sephardic merchants who make deals with the coastal population. So you solve the problem. When the Dutch don't come anymore, the Sephardic merchants won't come anymore, and well, we solve. There is a report which I came across that was ultimately the verdict, so to say, well, we can't do that. This by the officials residing, governing the area, that it was impossible to do. And it didn't go into details, because where was the money? These were not rich colonies where there was revenue, where they could carry out big projects. So most of these things, now the depopulation, the northwest coast of Hispaniola, a part of that did take place, and people were herded with their cattle to areas closer to Santo Domingo. And there they could, suggestions were sometimes, there they can work in the mines. Now, I don't know if there was a mine near Santo Domingo, that I didn't investigate. But they would say, well, we then have people in one place where they can work in. So that was labor considerations in areas that were dispersed populations. And was a factor. And so some of that project was carried out, depopulating the Northwest coast.
Hi, my name is Nora Lucas. I was wondering that question of labor. So you mentioned that the sugar refineries in the Netherlands, that there was a significant labor demand there. So was there a labor trade happening as well? Did you find any documentation of that?
Well, that is the sugar you're referring to, huh? Yeah. I did a research on the sugar trade and distribution before I wrote the book on the tobacco trade. I don't recall, and I'm not sure if it's documented, how many. I had records of, there are 60 sugar refineries in Amsterdam, but how big were they? It was a substantial processing, but I don't know how many people worked in the sugar factories. That I couldn't tell you. But we don't have a record in the tobacco processing where it says, well, we have 200 small shops in. There are some references to, now I stand corrected, there was a concern at a certain point in Amsterdam that too much of the tobacco trade, processing, and distribution was done by Jews in the 17th century. And that was, they could no longer do retail shopping. They could no longer have tobacco shops. But they were permitted to continue in the wholesale trade, the groothandel. And that means be engaged in supply of tobacco to Amsterdam and be engaged in marketing and distributing tobacco once it's processed, made into cigars and made into tobacco pouch. I don't know, but all these different forms of tobacco. So they were permitted to continue in the wholesale trade, but not in selling tobacco in Amsterdam. That was undermining the interest of that's tobacco merchant, the shops. So that's as far as I can say. Sugar refining was a different, sugar was an alien product. Yeah, how do I say that? It required more capital investment. There was a factory involved, and people worked in the factory. But tobacco was a different. Tobacco happened scattered throughout the city, but there were these key elements that made up us: tobacco supply and tobacco distributed. But the processing or the working of tobacco took place small scale, family, household. And so anyone who rolled cigars could also sell it in the street, probably right through the front window. And that was prohibited. Jews could no longer engage in the retail shopping.
And the value added for the tobacco cigar making, like in Cuba, they've really branded it, so you can get much more per unit than with sugar commodities. So that would be really.
It's a different product. Yeah.
So I guess what I'm asking is then, was the Dutch labor market then able to meet that demand?
Yeah, I would say that is the case. And it was probably the sugar refining. It was, well, Peter, we've seen sugar refiners working in Barbados. It's a matter of boiling it for a good amount and then straining it and then doing it again. And it is a hot and rather dirty, dangerous occupation. And it's not something you do in the basement or the attic of your house. Whereas tobacco is, well, peel it apart, you mix it and you add some from Venezuela, and then the Dutch began to grow their own tobacco, if you want to believe that. We had a tobacco cultivation in the Netherlands in the 17th century when supplies didn't suffice, if there were never embargoes and there wasn't enough coming to market, well, they began to grow tobacco in the Netherlands. So tobacco came from all over the place, and it was mixed and spun and folded into leaves and then sold cigar.
Please continue. I'm just going to put the book on the screen as well while we're getting more questions. Incidentally, one of our upcoming speakers, Peter Benson, who's the chair of our anthropology department, he wrote a book on tobacco capitalism. It's called Tobacco Capitalism with Princeton University Press. I don't know if you had, did you meet him? No, he wasn't able to make it.
The name mentioned, and so I thought about, he's
now the chair of our anthropology department. So you will get to meet him as well. But tobacco is fascinating as a product for study in human job.
That's interesting. I wish I could come back for the.
Well, you watch it on Zoom. You will watch it on Zoom. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk, Eva. So I'm picturing South America in my mind, the northeastern South America. We have Guyana, right? Suriname, French
Guyana, British Guyana,
And if my memory serves me correctly, Suriname, that was a Dutch colony, right?
Suriname was a Dutch colony.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, I think Guyana was English, right?
Yeah,
Anyway,
Guyana, English and French Guyana.
Because of those present day relationships, but way back when it was a Dutch colony, was there more tobacco trade concentrated there than there was, say, present day Guyana or present day French Guyana?
Yeah, I don't know, but tobacco came from Venezuela, what is today Venezuela.
I don't think those political entities existed
No.
when you were, it
Yeah,
was
not,
mostly controlled by Brazil, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And the Spanish,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah, Portuguese and
They
Brazil,
came-
and then the
those groups
Spanish.
came later.
We didn't have,
This actually came much later.
Yeah.
After.
many of these. No, I don't, better be careful here, these roads, whoops. Is that on the Zoom too? Barbados became to give you an example, Barbados became a British colony in 1627. Brazil had been throughout the 16th century a Portuguese colony. Yeah, so there were, and in the course of the 17th century, more and more, they all, the French, the English, the Dutch, all vied for a piece of the pie. Yeah, and I don't know when Dutch Guyana, Suriname, was founded as a Dutch colony sometime in the 17th century. And maybe some of you know more about the French and the English, but that happened throughout the 17th century and almost always based on the perception that there was profit to be made. You didn't venture with an army and navy vessels to conquer territory if it didn't have the profit element in it.
yeah.
So it is related. Spain, of course, ruled all these places. That goes back well, to the 16th century when the Spanish began to hold firm control over territory. But that didn't mean firm control, well, official control. Yeah, they became Spanish colonies. Some of them were ruled strictly if they had a lot at stake, Mexico, Peru. But in the Caribbean, that was usually not the case. So these were peripheral areas and not worthy of really establishing territorial boundaries or national boundaries till it became essential to protect your trade interests. I think that's how you should. Curacao, yeah, an example. A small island off the coast of South America became a Dutch colony. Now, the Dutch were really not the most renowned colonizers. We rather traded and raided than we did administer or rule. So, not rule we liked, but Curacao was in the 1640s.
I
when
put
it
the
became-
map up also,
Yeah,
so they know
okay.
where it is.
There you go, here.
There it is.
There is
There's
Curacao.
Trinidad, there's Curacao, there's Barbados. That's the most, it's the most eastern of the Caribbean major islands.
So I'm just talking, and none of these names appear on this map anymore. I refer to Cumana and Margarita Island, and you don't see this.
There's
Oh,
Margarita.
it is on.
Yeah, it's there.
it
There's
is.
Margarita.
Yeah, Margarita, yeah, so this coastal area,
It's now part of Venezuela.
Yeah.
And there's Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah.
Which is now better known for its oil industry than tobacco, but that's why the British wanted to hold on to it, was more for the oil, but that was in the 19th century.
Yeah. I know some graduate students probably have very little experience with archival research. Without going into a long exposition, but would you say just a few words about what it's like to actually do archival research? Because I don't think a lot of people have experience with that.
Yeah.
well, I'll be happy and glad to, because that's what I've done for all these years. And how can you, yeah, we all come to a research project, we think. There's a hypothesis or a model, yeah. Or then you say, I need to find out more about this, and this, and this, and this, and this. And then I can test my hypothesis and see if that's valid research. Well, archival research you stumble into, maybe that's sort of the way you could Now you stumble into it. If you're of the mindset I have when I go places, and I've done it since my undergraduate years in Groningen. I've done archival research. To me, the most interesting thing is to find out more about the place by going to a library to read up on the historical events, or to go to the archives and find what that is to be learned. So many of these, I could say, certainly these two books evolved as I continue to stumble into interesting pieces. And the one that Peter described for the Barbados, the sugar trade research, was like that. I go one afternoon when we have a conference to an archive, and I say, oh, they all mentioned that the Dutch merchants were trading. Well, what do we know about that? And who are these merchants? So you go further. So soon you go, when I did, go back to visit my home country for the summer months, when in academia we have 3 months off, and I go back home. And I have friends in Amsterdam, and they say, oh, come visit. And I said, well, I gladly do, but know that tomorrow I'll visit the archives. Now, how do you do that? Of course, any kind of archival collection has, if it's organized well, and fortunately, more and more, certainly in the Western European countries, not all, Jamaica was not the best indexed or organized archive I've been in. I had to do a lot of searching through files in the box, so to say. But if they're well organized, then you have an index. And you go to a description of the file, and you say, oh, yeah, let me take a look at that. How far do you want to go? We need to talk about archival.
Talk about a little about
But there's a little
excitement and the
Yeah.
exploration
Yeah.
and perhaps refer to the Slater collection, how you discovered that it
Yeah.
exists. What a gold mine it is.
Yeah, but a gold mine it is. But it's an, I know many of you in graduate programs today would never venture out to do what I ended up doing. It is, you have a very different, you've had a different education than I had. But when I began to do my undergraduate research, as someone interested in historical geography, you're sent off to the archives. I had an advisor in the University of Groningen who said, well, I send you off to one of the islands and you need to take a look at the archives. There's no further instructions.
Yeah, it's like a treasure hunt.
It was part of your education in geography, not in history. I don't know if you're sent off to do work in archives, no. So I don't think there are many people like Peter and I are today still going to archives when we spend time out of home.
But I would actually urge our geospatial friends, this is really an area where there's a lot of new effort. And in fact, one of the MacArthur Fellows recently, was given for someone who was using geospatial data science to look at archives of, different kinds of data, and then use that to develop new techniques for analyzing them and so on. So there's a way to connect the two, because there's just a treasure trove. Plus, like looking at historical sea level, locations. So you compare. Now there are other people who are using art, archives of art to see how forests were before, and now seeing how has land use change occurred as a result of that. And then, so there's amazing stuff which you can do with archives, which is very relevant to contemporary problems that often we miss,
We still find colleagues like myself at archives, you sit around a big table, usually, old furniture, maybe
We have very good
maybe
art.
even a bit musty smelling, yeah, kind of picture that. And then you converse with each other
Yeah.
during coffee hour. Many of these more traditional oriented have still coffee hour. Then you meet, and you're often led into a different direction or a suggestion from someone else. Have you looked at them? No, I was there. So it's a totally different and not necessarily, though, as you say, you can, if you go and look at land
Yeah.
and you know, well, some of the climate, the geology, this and that. And you look at what was this land used for, what evidence do we have of where these moats were around this castle or and who lived. So, I mean, there are ways into this doing what I am doing in a very traditional way and totally unsystematic.
Yeah.
But I have to say that once I am onto a question, you know, what makes for the difference in the direction of the expansion of trade from east to west in the sugar trade and from west to east in the tobacco trade, what does that suggest about who engaged in the trade? Now, that is a legitimate research question. So that sits there in the back of my mind once I began to realize that. And so you begin, as you go, you begin to do more and more and more and more systematic searches. But it started for me as a total accidental occurrence, having a conference in Barbados in 1992 to discover that is a research topic Now, how then do you approach that? Well, I'm Dutch, so I began to say, I know about sugar and Amsterdam. So you build your sort of concept. Yeah. There was always a conceptual approach in the research I was doing. And I think that is important. It's not a testable hypothesis, but a conceptual idea, an idea. And I happen to believe, and I've debated left and right, and you may have too, with colleagues, well, did it all start at the source of where the material came from or at the source where the trade was coordinated?
Yeah.
That's always the question. And I've debated that left and right with his colleagues. But in a broad sense, I believe in a conceptual model of development that you can call, or we used to call, when we were reading world system theory, Wallerstein. I believe still that much of it can be encapsulated in a core curriculum. And students who work with me 2 years know that also. This is my conceptual framework in almost anything I've done in terms of research. Very, very topics, but that is the back of my mind, the concept that always goes into whatever that. So in my
that's
story
really
goes back
great.
to Amsterdam.
And archives, just to give you an example of how archival research has been used even in natural sciences, the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2015 was given to this Chinese researcher who basically, she discovered artemisinin, which is one of the most widely used anti-malarials, and she discovered it going through archives of ancient traditional Chinese medicine. And the Nobel Committee recognized just the fact, the method she used, which is very different from current, reductionist approaches to drug discovery. So it's archives are very special places. And I've used archives in my most recent book, Soil to Foil. I went to Oberlin College to look at the archives of the guy who discovered how you could process bauxite and extract aluminum, who was an undergraduate student at Oberlin. So for those, any undergrads here, you can do great things as an undergrad. He was a chemistry undergrad, and his archive has all the ways, his notebooks of how he came about this. And he became the CEO of Alcoa. He was the founder of the world's largest
Yeah.
aluminum company, Charles Hall. So.
Yeah. Yeah, so.
Yes,
Don't be
Tanya,
surprised,
please,
you can-
please.
Yeah,
Thank you, Ida, for your presentation, Kanan. I'm first year PhD student. My background is in architecture and conservation of monuments and sites. And during my master's thesis, I had the opportunity to study the Dutch presence in India. And I studied a bunch of Dutch monuments in the western coast of India and Surat, which is also the London hub. Yeah. And I did my master's thesis with the Ministry of Culture in the Netherlands. So I spent about 6 to 8 months in Amsterdam, between Amsterdam and Amsterdam, studying the Dutch archives.
yeah,
And it was a really interesting experience because I was just learning Dutch, like
yeah.
through the books. So today I can just read and understand Dutch, but I can't speak.
Yeah, no, that's sort of my level of Spanish. I can follow it because I know enough words, but I can't speak.
That was
And-
interesting for me because I studied the Dutch East India Company's presence.
Yeah,
And they were not colonizers in India. They were just traders, merchants. And I studied the people who were buried there with no names on graves.
Yeah.
So for me, it was combining the two sides of the story, the actual tangible monuments in India.
Yeah.
And the logbooks of the trade merchants.
of the merchants, yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and
And there were
actually-
logbooks. There were logbooks of the merchants who had.
Yes. All the.
Because I've looked for logbooks on the tobacco merchants, and since it was the devil's weed and an illegal trade good, there are no logs of mariners who say, and I took two, well, there are a few, but not many, that say, well, I have 10 chests of tobacco in my cabin. But you were able to find merchant logs. Yeah?
Yes, and I was able to connect the dots in both places and find out who were the people who were buried actually.
I have a question for you, and that is curiosity. I'm familiar with working in Dutch archives. They're generally well organized. The personnel of which there are sufficient and they're very helpful. Now, I say that I speak Dutch, but for foreigners, when they come to a Dutch archive to do research, what was your experience?
Well, for me, Google Translate.
Yeah, also you would request, can you help me translate?
So I would have some scans usually sent to me electronically, and then I had a bunch of funerary historians, Dutch funerary historians who were actually helping me with the translations. But in case they're not available and I'm alone at the archives, I would use Google Translate to actually scan it.
Yeah,
But
Yeah,
it took a lot of time but then those were the only evidences because in India, these monuments were not documented well. None of these names, none of these stories appear in the Indian archives anywhere. So it was essential that these historical archives in the Netherlands were brought to India in some way. And even today, only my master's has the names. And I just tried to inventorize these monuments.
fascinating. Fascinating.
I would imagine in Sri Lanka, maybe they have some, was it Gaul, which was a Dutch?
Goa, yeah.
No, not Goa, Gaul. There's a city in Sri Lanka which had a big Dutch settlement, and maybe they have something, but I don't know. Goa was Portuguese, but Gaul was Dutch.
Yeah.
So it might be.
But it was Adrian Van Ryn who was the governor, and he was a botany enthusiast. So he did a lot of his own botany research in South of India and Kerala. And he wrote the London Moretus, the botany book. Famous Dutch.
Oh, you get me onto it. Anyway,
My question is, are the Sephardic communities, are they part of the Dutch East India Company or were they their own private organization operating in the?
Well, I don't know the details of. I know more about the West India Company, which gladly took the opportunity to take advantage of Sephardic merchants. I don't know to what extent that was the case with the East India Company. East India Company was started earlier, 1603, I believe. You may correct me. The West India Company was 1621, but so. I don't know the details of each thing.
There's an amazing book about the East India Company that just came out that you may be familiar with, The Anarchy by William Dalrymple, and it's about the whole history of the East India Company. You know, Dalrymple is a fantastic writer of South Asian, but it's really great. But any other questions? One question I thought, I don't know, Peter, you mentioned that Ida had worked in Iran before.
I
We
have
have
worked
had-
in Iran.
So we have several Iranian students, the largest country represented in our students. I was wondering, so if you have any thoughts
I
on
was-
when you
I
worked in
was
Iran?
Pakistan, in the town Andimesk,
Yes.
Despo Andimesk. And it was an archaeological survey, an excavation, conducted by the University of Michigan, Illinois. I was a graduate student there. Was it fascinating?
Which year was it?
That was 1970.
1973. The year I was born.
Something like that.
That was the year I was born. So-
So we were ancient. But that was 3 months then. But fascinating, and I have to, may I just share with you, this was for me the first experience traveling by myself to a small town in Khuzestan in the south of Iran, and I flew into Tehran. I had a contract, good Lord, 73, I had a contract with the University of Michigan. To take care of my own travel, and I was welcome to come, and I would get a per diem. Yeah. Well, you can make a living in archaeology this way, that would be nice for me. I traveled, flew into Tehran airport, then I took the train. With a little compartments, and I shared the compartment with a couple from Pakistan. And I spoke English, so I was able to converse because I was French. I might not even be able to communicate. It was an adventure. It was a fantastic experience, and this couple turned out to be very helpful when I arrived, as I was to be picked up by someone from the field service, where I was employed to work. And that took a bit. So this couple helped me to get in contact with the local.
And any university in Iran was involved in this project?
There was a group, no, not from Tehran University or anything. There was a group of British archaeologists too, and they stayed in Tehran and had a sort of a home base there, but no, there was not an involvement with local, they were most all foreigners. Foreign students.
One more question about tobacco, because in history we studied that Iran was one of the producers of tobacco in 18th or 19th century, and they exported to the UK. Did you?
That's quite possible. There's like Turkey too. Turkey developed a very large tobacco industry, so did Iran. From my records, and now we go back again to the early 17th century, the merchants trade in tobacco. The Sephardic merchants who traded in tobacco reached all the way to Persia. So tobacco was introduced in that trade route, but then, as happened in the Netherlands, you can grow tobacco here in Europe or in Middle East or just about any place. It's not a crop that is. I mean, grow it in Lancaster here. I don't think so.
It's a weed, that's why.
It's a weed.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And so, in Persia, the same. And I'm sure that, and once you have established a crop cultivation and you have contact through a network of merchants, you can export it to just about any place rather than wanting it. more people smoke tobacco now in most of the rest of the world than in Europe. Let's be valid about that. Yeah, so expansion is possible just about anywhere. I know Turkey has a very high producing tobacco industry, so does Iran.
I think our time.
We
is
spent
pretty much
time
up.
just-
I just want to thank you again, Edith, very much for
Thank
coming
you.
up and spending time with us and giving us a sense of all the work that you've done over the years.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. And
It was a real
Thank you.
pleasure to be here.
it was a real honor to have you. And for next week, for the students, we are having a very special session on journal writing. Professor Pinky Mondal, who is the editor of a new journal called Earth Interaction. She will be giving like a workshop on journal article writing. She's an editor now, so she, sees the back end really well. And Earth Interactions is especially relevant for us because it's published by AAG, AGU, and AMS. So all the three major associations with which we have interface, okay?
Salim, I think you do a wonderful job organizing this. I feel very honored. that you-
I'm so glad we could make it.